I would like to start with your education in music. As a matric student in Port Elizabeth, you were the leader of the second violins in the University of Port Elizabeth string quartet. Were you mainly a performer at that time?
Actually, I was mainly a pianist at that time. So the violin was my second instrument, and I worked my way up from the back desk of the third violins actually, and also worked in the first violins, and then the opportunity arose, and so for a while I led the second violins.
Okay. And you studied music at the University of Port Elizabeth and at the University of Cape Town. At what point did you start to gain interest in composition?
I was always interested in composition from when I was about 11, but I used to improvise a lot on the piano as well, and I think some of it was, from having learnt all the arpeggios and scales and my father whistling tunes in my ears. And so my teacher at the time was Angeline Scholz, and she was quite strict, and she really wanted me to attend to the Mozart and the Beethoven and the Bach, a lot of Baroque work, and my discipline and my technique development and posture and all kinds of things. So, those things kind of overtook my little nascent ideas of composition. And also there was just no encouragement to do that. Girls were not encouraged, I think, at the time generally, but I think also my teachers saw me as a performer, and so they felt that was the best route for me.
So you mentioned the improvisation and as a way of working. How do you compose now? Do you still use a way of improvisation?
I don't have any one particular way, but I can tell you that I usually hear what it is that I must write down. So I don't follow any particular school of composition or any particular ideology. I don't think of some kind of pattern in advance that I must follow or go for a certain scale or anything else. So usually it's from hearing it. Quite often it's been linked to words or to a theme, an idea, a ballet, a story. So perhaps on the programmatic side rather than the abstract side. And so the improvisation is a bit different. I might just have a feeling and not even hear in advance what I must play. And as I start to play, it kind of has a journey of its own.
Your music studies culminated with a DMAS in composition at the University of Pretoria. Who was your promoter and who or what significantly influenced your creative work?
I should tell you that I think for many years my most significant promoter has been Dr. Jeannie Zeidel-Rudolph, who became the head of music at WITS and was the head of music at WITS for many years, WITS School of Music. She had known me for a number of years, and I had taken to her a composition that I was writing called The Rainbow's Child, which was a musical, a stage musical, because I had always had a love for stage musicals. And they were a little bit looked down upon by the classical sort of fraternity, but I found them rather charming and always wanted to participate in a musical actually as either a dancer or a singer or a painter or whatever, and was never really encouraged, in fact I would say discouraged from doing that, because I had quite a few respiratory illnesses as a child, and my teachers and my parents wanted me to carry on practicing the piano, and as I said, they felt that that was my direction, so they didn't want me to jeopardize my health and my time by taking part in long rehearsals, etc. But I was fascinated and captivated by musicals, and still am actually. There is a kind of a magic of, when you're walking down the pavement, for people to suddenly start tap dancing and doing whatever they do. It is rather unusual, but it's got a charm about it. And so that's when I decided to take this further with Jeannie Zeidel when she came to a performance of The Rainbow's Child in 2001 at the National Art School, and I had a cast of about 90 on the stage, 30 in the pit, and quite a team backstage to put on this ecological fantasy musical. And when she heard that the cast recording had not worked out, because of technical difficulties, she then invited me to come and do a doctorate at WITS, and she said, make your composition count for something, and because I was very disappointed obviously that my recording had not worked out, and so she then said, but okay, so use this as one of your portfolio works, and what else are you writing? And that was the point when I thought I would write a Requiem, partly because I was feeling very down and sort of dispirited after losing several months if not years of work. And so I started on a Requiem and decided to turn it into a Requiem for the living. instead of for the dead, because a Requiem is a prayer for the dead. And so I felt that it would be more helpful to people maybe is to turn something which could have been negative into something positive, a turning over from death to life, if you like. And that became a long journey for me. It was a journey from exclusivity to inclusivity, a journey of reintegration, and it took me a number of years to write that as part of my doctoral study. Prior to that, of course, I'd had a master's degree from the University of Cape Town, and that was very much a piano practical qualification, and my teachers there were Laura Searle and Lamar Crowson, so I'm coming out of UCT's very best teachers, and huge amounts of energy were put into my playing, and I won scholarships to a private school in France, actually, where I had another marvellous teacher who had taught a whole generation of French pianists. She was a little old lady called Lilia Gousseau. So I've been extremely fortunate over many years to have all these piano teachers and composition mentors like Jeannie Seidel, and also I had Jack de Wet as my violin teacher, and so he was also a great pedagogue and introduced me, of course, to all the orchestral sounds really through the string orchestra, and then I played in the National Youth Orchestra as well in the second violins there. So you know, I was carried along actually on the shoulders of some very strong teaching influences and very kind and helpful, supportive people.
So I'm fascinated by the research component of your DMAS degree. Your thesis is entitled Archetypes and Symbols and How They Are Expressed in Selected Hero Theme Musicals of the 20th Century. Can you please tell me more about this work?
You know, I would have to go and read it again myself to be able to tell you in any detail what it's about, but yes, loosely I became very interested in the writings of Carl Gustav Jung. And of course Jung was a psychiatrist who developed his whole approach describing the archetypes as loosely shapes in the soul, I suppose, in the psyche. And so I started looking at the symbolic nature of stories, and I, of course, had always had this fascination with musicals. And the hero's journey, I think somebody gave me a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and that was written by Joseph Campbell. I think it could have been Carl van Wyk. Now, Carl van Wyk is a composer who was at the head of music at Wits before Jeannie Seidel, and also I had known him since I was 11 years old because he was previously at the University of Port Elizabeth. So when I went there and I was now going to do my doctoral study, and I was, you know, talking to them about all these kind of ideas and thoughts that I would have about archetypes, he gave me this title of The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and then I got more involved in Joseph Campbell and read all the other writings about mythology, and overlapping with Jung, I then started to look at certain musicals and realized that many of them had either similar themes or they had archetypal themes. And so I settled on the hero one, not really realizing that this was really the major myth of the Western world for about the last 2,000 years. So, and of course all the Disney movies I discovered later only are all based on this kind of thematic underlying archetypal story. But I must have been influenced subliminally by all of that, and I didn't realize even in writing The Rainbow's Child that I was in fact writing my own heroine's journey. And I didn't choose, funnily enough, The Sound of Music, although that was one of the first musicals that I remember hearing and seeing, or the other one, Mary Poppins, although those were both female heroes, if you like, heroines. I went more for, instead of going for the literal heroine, I went rather for the symbolic heroine. And I created a little character in my own musical called Tumbleweed, and Tumbleweed, I suppose you could say, is an androgynous character, but not really, because Tumbleweed is a wish who fell to earth. So there's a symbolic character. And so I looked at the symbolism in Jesus Christ Superstar, which was one of the musicals I looked at, and also The Man of La Mancha, which was actually Don Quixote's story, and there were two others. One was called sorry, I'll have to actually think about this now. The Fantastics. The Fantastics was actually a French play, which was then written into a musical which ran on in Broadway, I think, for something like 35 years. A fantastic story. Literally, it was called The Fantastics, but I'd heard a production of this live, and I was really taken by not only the musical language and the way it was put together, but also the characterization and the development of the characters. And I think the fourth one was Camelot. Oh yes, Camelot, fascinatingly enough, of course, the sword in the stone, taking the sword out of the stone, taking back your inner authority, your inner power in life. That is a absolutely bang in the middle of the road story about human development, about the development of the child growing up or into a young adult. And you'll see that there were large indications of that in American history, actually, at the time that the Kennedy president was shot, Jackie Kennedy's husband. There was a huge sort of push again towards the Camelot legend in writings and in TV programs and in other movie-related material, and a lot of books. So it's quite interesting that these things seem to be kind of cyclic, and they keep on repeating themselves, and it's as if generations of people attach themselves to these because they're useful. They're ways of reintegrating the psyche without really knowing that you're doing that. It's as if the story does it for you, and the music is also a vehicle for the story. So you're carried along by the music and the story, and then perhaps you attach yourself to elements of that or find resonances in yourself of those stories. And that's why I found this so fascinating to examine. And while I would say that music written for musicals depended also very much on who the composer was and who their composition teachers were and what their influences were, it is still possible to isolate and look at certain factors within musical language which have, for example, the tension between opposites arranged in the musical language. And you will see this repeating itself throughout the production, for instance. Or you might have certain other characteristics dating back to the theory of the affections, the Affektenlehre, which is from about the 17th century, all kinds of conventions in musical practice which were derived from Roman oratory and taken over into Baroque practice. And you'll find those actually are also used. Let's say you want to create a movement of something going around in circles. Your musical language can actually do that by going in a little circular kind of musical motif.
Okay.
And so it was fascinating to look at that, and then also in the Jesus Christ Superstar, I remember looking at the language of the 40 lashes and the way it repeated and repeated and repeated, and you know, we were also developing through the beginnings of minimalism. And it's quite fascinating how there's a kind of cross-pollination between popular and then more serious musics. So,
and that has, from listening to what you said, that has clearly influenced your compositional work later on.
It's not random what I'm doing. I think that there is a sense that improvisation is random. I don't think that it has to be. I think it could be. One could just go anywhere with it and see where it takes you, and sometimes it's quite fun to do that. But somehow it's more like a mirror of what's going on the inside is going to come out on the outside. I think, because I also have quite advanced piano skills, so for me to sit down in front of a piano and improvise, I don't really have to think about it, and I don't think about key choice, and I don't think about really where I might go with it. And the other person I've worked with actually as a musician is also a very free improviser called Francois Leroux. He calls himself Francois Harman, and he has travelled around the world doing improvisations, and the two of us have worked together. In the beginning it was quite a lot stiffer, the association, so we might take a piece that was written down, or chords, or melodic fragment, and we would explore that together. But as we got to know one another over the years and performed, for the most part we would do completely free improvisation in public, from scratch, no preparation, no discussion, no decision about the starting note, absolutely, totally free from beginning to end. and then having more like a conversation, so as if his cello was saying something, but not necessarily saying anything specific. But it's more like as I say, a kind of, I would think of it like two seals. If you see seals in the water and they are just playing, that's what it's about. It's about playing. And so I've put some examples of my work like that out there, also on LinkedIn, where Francois and I have spent time in improvising totally freely.
When I look at everything you have achieved, you fulfilled various roles as a performer, teacher, composer. Do these roles support each other, and how do you maintain this balance?
Well, juggling not so much artistic balls. I'm actually juggling more business balls, and I don't really have a lot of, I have no training in business or marketing, although I have a bit of a flair, I think. I've got an entrepreneurial flair, I've got ideas. Now I'm just about to launch a little art competition, also based on the Rainbow's Child, for instance. Because I started to think strategically how one could possibly merchandise the Rainbow's Child, because it's an eco-fantasy, it's educational, other people are also doing things similar, I suppose. And I live in the business capital of South Africa, so I felt it was worth trying, and I asked a lot of advice. People are very kind to give a lot of advice. But in terms of juggling the other side, the artistic side, the creative side, I don't play very often anymore. I don't practice classical music. To tell you the truth, I don't even listen to a lot of music, because from teaching it for hours and hours every day, I came home wanting silence. And so I've learned how to value silence and to listen also to where it is and what I should be doing, where I should be going, what I should be doing. I've gone back to listening to my inner voice, and in a way that's also a creative factor, because if I'm not following my inner voice, then I will have nothing to say. I will have nothing creatively to say. And it's one of the reasons why I want to move, to relocate now to the UK, because I want different influences. I want to hear new voices. I want to see new art. I would like to have some of the stimulation that I've enjoyed before in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm not saying that there's no stimulation here, but it is different. And I want the freedom to start creating something new, if there's still something new inside me to create, not only doing business and administrative things and raising funding.
So you were teaching at Rodin School previously. You taught violin, voice and piano. So did you ever teach composition at high school level or at school level?
No, and in fact, although there was one teacher who asked me to come into a class to show a work or a few works that I was writing at that time, funnily enough they were also semi-serious works on Afrikaans texts by a poet. It's almost as if a real live composer in a school is almost an anathema to the whole system. So even though I have a lot of value to share, I was very, very underutilized at a school. And there have been comments that I might have been more utilized, and I could have been, communicated more of my compositional skills, my arranging skills, maybe in a university setting. Now, I'm not entirely convinced of that, but because I feel I get along with children, and whether they're junior or senior school children, very well. And in fact, so what I started to do was to initiate my own projects, more in the primary school than the senior school, where they've got to follow a very specific sort of compositional syllabus. And so 2 years ago I decided to do some art and music based workshops with children, which I called Rainbow Warriors. And so children who wanted to, in the junior school, they had a free hour once a week where they could decide what they wanted to do. Go colouring in, or beading, or swimming in a team, or coming to the Rainbow Warriors. And then we used clay and art materials, and I played the piano for them and taught them some songs, told them about the characters, and off they went and created games. I suggested that I should try creating games, indoor or outdoor, based on the characters. And so they kind of adopted my story characters and made up their own games. So that was fascinating, watching children create and helping them along and immersing them in my sort of fantasy. Some of them even felt the freedom to bring along their own characters. So we had a little red fox that was introduced into my characters, and her name was Frida Kahlo. So obviously a child who was very influenced by Frida Kahlo and was taken by that story brought the little animal that she created, and that animal joined my other little fantasy creature. So and we collated that into a book called well, it was a downloadable game book on the Rainbow's Child website, using some of my story background of the Rainbow's Child and some other artworks and the children's games, and so I made that into a downloadable game book, and we've gifted it to children worldwide. Actually, I sent it to Greenpeace in Britain, and they wrote back to me to say they were very grateful to have material that they could share with children.
So this theme of a rainbow seemed to feature quite a lot in your works. What is in the rainbow?
Okay, so the Rainbow's Child was this journey, I suppose, of the gift or the wish that fell to earth, and then went on a journey of seeking the magic feathers of a rainbow bird who had lost her feathers in a disaster earlier on in the story, and then restoring the feathers to her, and then she was guarding the secret of the rainbow, which is a seed of hope, and she brought hope to the world. So it's one of those kind of rather fairy tale-ish type of stories, I suppose, a symbolic story of reintegrating after disintegration, because the story starts when there's been a huge explosion and everybody was virtually blown apart, and some of the characters lost 3 legs, and like a spider only had 5 left, and the snail. In fact, it's a whole story of where we are in history right now in terms of ecology, because we are sitting with wildfires in California and tornadoes and destruction all over the place and plastic in the oceans. And I started on this journey long ago, when people who were involved in ecology were thought to be tree huggers and green freaks. So we're talking about, you know, a journey of 35 years. So that's where the rainbow idea came from. But also, of course, the 7 keys, the 7 colors of the rainbow. These things just worked their way, the music of the spheres, that worked their way into my work, because those were the influences, those were the things that I was exposed to, so I brought them into my story.
Does your husband, Paul Bukoy, who is a music critic, have any influence on your work?
He doesn't have influence, but what I would say, firstly, he can never write about me. So he can never write a review, and he can never promote me in any way, because that would be unethical. And we discussed that many years ago already, and we've stuck to it all the way through. But where he is very valuable is if I'm actually writing something. He's a sounding board, of course, because he's got a wonderful pair of ears and a great experience. And has listened to many other composers and other performers, and so he is quite able to point out to me if he feels that the work is perhaps a bit too cluttered, or where I need to perhaps focus on bringing certain things to the foreground, or when it is feeling a bit long or whatever. So those kind of things in the formative stages maybe of something. If I need to have a sounding board, then Paul's always been a good one.
And what was it like to enter the composition scene when you did, as a female composer?
I don't think I've ever entered the composition scene, to tell you the truth. I think that I started to compose with the Rainbow's Child and a few songs, and I went on to the Requiem for the Living, and for the most part I have not really had very much input or influence from any other composers, except a little bit from Jeannie Zeidel after my master's degree. So I was already at doctoral level. I went to some of her master's lectures for the other students, but I worked to a large extent on my own. And then more recently, though, I did approach Hendrik Hofmeyer, because I wanted to write a little opera about Gaynor Young, the South African actress who fell on her head in 1989. And so then I started to write an opera which I've called Lost in a Bluebell Wood. And in order to successfully bring together the elements that needed to come together musically and artistically in that, I felt instinctively that I wanted to speak to Hendrik, Hendrik Hofmeyer is a contemporary of mine. I think he's about 1 year older. I think he was a year ahead of me at UCT. And so I always admired him. He was also a formidable pianist, I must tell you.
Yes.
And an incredible intellect, a wonderful lecturer. I wish that I had had lecturers like Hendrik in my theoretical music actually. He's a very intense researcher of information, and he's able to convey it very clearly, and I just have a lot of admiration for Hendrik, and so he was very helpful in pointing out certain things that I could also explore and do. And
so you spoke about this opera Lost in the Blue Bellwood, and it might sound less serious, but it is very serious, specifically dealing with Gaynor Young at the State Theatre in Pretoria, where she fell off the stage.
That's right.
And she had hearing loss and brain damage and
vision loss as well, actually. Yes.
So how did this opera unfold?
Well, okay, so years ago I remember for some reason being very influenced by Helen Keller, the stories of Helen Keller. And that has always haunted me, the fact that she was a little girl who then lost her vision and her hearing completely and was a lost little person until her teacher arrived, a miracle worker of a teacher who taught this little deaf and blind girl how to communicate with hand palm signals, and then later on you would put her hand on the face of her teacher and on the throat and catch all the vibrations, and she is actually able to speak. And intelligibly as well, you know, she's perfectly understandable. Mm-hmm. And then to have such an incredible insight into life at a deep level, I really have a great admiration. And I think in a way, Gaynor for me was sort of South Africa's Helen Keller, although she lost her hearing and her sight much later, of course, in her 20s. But she was an aspiring actress and very good, and so that fall that she took was such a devastating event, not only in her life, but it had repercussions throughout the sort of industry. We are virtually contemporaries. I think I'm a little bit older than Gaynor, perhaps a year or two, and I remember that, and I remember the newspaper writings about it and the shockwaves that went through the art industry. And so for many years I had that sort of in the back of my mind somewhere, and then one day I had tea with Toby Cronje, and he said to me, why don't you write a little opera for, it was a South African singer at that stage who's gone overseas now, and she had studied at the Juilliard, who had a beautiful little voice. So the whole profile of the operas followed this fall and then rise. So I only realized that, of course, when I started thinking this story reminds me of something else. What does it remind me of? So I went to the library and found a book on Greek myth, and after reading 2 or 3 of them I realized it's actually the myth of Demeter and Persephone that it reminded me of. And Demeter was the mother and Persephone the daughter in what is basically it's not a creation myth, it's a season myth. It's a myth of the seasons, whereby a seed will go into the ground and it will die in the winter and then be rejuvenated in the spring and grow into a plant, so come out of the darkness and into the light and then bear flowers and fruit and then die again, and the seed falls back into the ground. Mm-hmm. And in fact that's the story, that's the Greek myth. But in the story, of course, it was a way of explaining to the people of the time who were not literate what was happening when a seed fell into the earth. But the whole symbolism is a cyclic one of death and rebirth, death and rebirth. And in fact, that's the same kind of theme I've had in the Requiem for the Living, which is also a death and then a rebirth. So a turning around from death to life. That kind of symbolism I've done. I've written quite a bit of my work with that kind of influence in it. And the Tree of Life, of course. So in the Tree of Life is a very ancient symbol. It's in many cultures, it goes back thousands of years. The connectivity, of course, to the earth, and then the reaching up towards the heavens, or the stars, and towards higher understanding, and towards insight into the meaning of life. So I'll tell you a little bit more on my journey, juxtaposing or noticing, let's say, rather than juxtaposing, and just noticing in nature that somehow we seem to have these 2 very powerful elements of exquisite beauty and then harshness at the other side. And of course there is a whole kind of world in between that, but I'm interested in how these opposites, it seems as if they're opposites, as if they somehow are also part of a combination somehow. I don't know what the key to that is, It's a fascination for me,
Mm-hmm.
because beauty has such power, and harshness also has such power. But we seem to be noticing in the world more and more, we seem to be focusing much more on the harshness. And so I suppose I've taken quite a deliberate stance to focus on the beautiful. And for me, that is a form of protest of its own.
You also wrote the libretto for this opera. Did you find it beneficial to set your own words to music?
Yes, I think I did. There was a stage when I was looking for somebody to write the libretto for me, and that person did not appear. And so I just took the matter in hand myself, and I thought, well, if I want a libretto, I will have to write one. And I've written song lyrics before, and I also wrote lyrics in Requiem for the Living, so I was familiar with it. And English was my second subject at school, so my second favorite subject too. So I followed basically the profile of the myth with Grainor's story woven in, and it kind of had it has a mythic language to it, so there is a natural flow in the poetry of it. And I won't say it writes itself, I mean that sounds a bit weird, but it does have something of that element. It's a bit like water. When water starts to flow in a direction and you keep on adding water, it will keep on flowing. So I just thought about the story, and and the words came out of the other end of my pen. It's a bit like the way I write music. I don't know where it comes from. It's patterns. I suppose it's patterns. I have to say it must have something to do with patterns, I suppose.
You mentioned Requiem for the Living, which is an opera dealing with AIDS orphans. And it's a very current issue. How do you use music to get these important messages across?
That's a very interesting question. All right, so, and it's an oratorio, remember, so there's no acting involved, so it's a much more concert-like work, if you like, although I used praise singers in here. And they were part of getting the message across, because I used old biblical texts from the Psalms, and those were praise psalms mostly that I chose, and so they were intoning the Psalms as if they were praise singers, intoning the best characteristics of the chief. And I had seen that happening with a man called Zweli, who was the praise singer at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela, and he was enormously exciting. He was charging up and down and making up the poetry as he went along. I presume he had a theme, and he knew of the great deeds of the chief, but that was very influential. So that was written over the music, if you like. It was an overlay. But if you had to ask how I write the music to actually put across these deep realities, or my compassion for AIDS orphans, I have to honestly say I have no idea. All I can tell you is that the AIDS orphans, it struck me at the time that they were very vulnerable, and still are. And they had no future because they're small children who might be on death row. And my own child was about 4. And from that, it's as if the voices of the children somehow found their way into the music. Not that there were any children who participated except a choir from Pretoria who sang part of the Dies Irae. But it was more like the anguish somehow translated into music which described that, which was perhaps chaotic, and that was to do with our having lost our way in society, to be abandoning children who are in such need, and also the dislocation of humanity from its better side, showing its worst side in and getting lost, the disintegratedness of it. Disintegration for me is actually almost a kind of getting closer to the devilish side, if you like. So let's say the tritone divides the octave in half, and then if you know that this is called diabolus in musica, which means the devil in music, it basically slices the octave in half and disintegrates the diatonic harmony, the more and more chromatic you become. So these are all things that I have probably been taught and been exposed to, but they're somewhere lying in the psyche. And when I start to actually consider what it is that I want to express, for instance, right at the beginning of my Requiem for the Living, I started where Verdi ended, on a Libera Me, because I'm also writing in a tradition. And there are other people who've written requiems before me, so out of respect to the great composers, I would know those works or have listened to them to some degree. I heard that live, by the way, in the City Hall, the Verdi Requiem many years ago, with Michelle Crydor singing. It was actually phenomenal. And I remembered then that it ended on the Libera Me, so I thought, well, that might be a good place to start. And so then in my lyrics, I would perhaps explore a liberation of self, of myself, from my previous prejudices and my previous ideas, to make a kind of request to the spirit of creation, or of my muse, or the divine spirit, to lead me in a direction to start my journey. And so Libera Me actually started with the sound of bells, and it is reminiscent of Gregorian chant. But it's not Gregorian chant.
Yes.
But it was a way of starting the journey of liberation, of a way of getting into it.
I understand that Archbishop Desmond Tutu and soprano Mimi Kurtze are patrons of your Requiem for the Living.
Yes, I was very fortunate that one of my, the company members of Requiem for the Living, which is a little NPO which was formed to raise the money for the production of Requiem for the Living, the oratorio, knew Archbishop Tutu from Pace College, and so she wrote him a letter and said would he agree to be the patron of Requiem for the Living, and he liked the sentiments of it, and so he wrote back to us. And then years later I approached the Tutu Foundation and said, you know, could this be cemented a little bit more, and would he be able to perhaps read a Bible verse for us at the beginning? And I think it was Romans 8, and he read the text for us in the recording, as well as remaining as one of the patrons. And then, of course, when I first started out with this, I approached Mimi Kurtze through the Black Tie Ensemble, because 8 of them came to sing for me, the singers of the Black Tie Ensemble. We did a tiny little production with the Randburg Symphony Orchestra, playing the orchestral parts of one of the sections of Requiem for the Living called In Paradisum. And so I had a boy soprano, and at the time that was my son, and I wrote that for him actually. It was inspired by him, and it was supposed to be the child spirit and then the mother, so Madonna and child, which is symbolically then the sky and the earth. And we are nature's child on the earth. The earth is also a mother, of course. So all these images are kind of interwoven. But the Black Tie Ensemble came to sing, or some of them did, and they sang the chorus parts in and the lyrics of the In Paradisum. And the title goes on Le baiser de l'enfant Jésus, which means the kiss of the infant Jesus. So I had then associated heaven with the kiss of the infant, which is the new life and the connection to mother and the connection to the earth, the nurturing kind of nucleus of the work. And so Mimi Kurtze was approached on my behalf by the person who was running the Black Tie Ensemble at the time, on Kluti, and she agreed to become the patron also, because it was a vocal work.
Yeah.
And she in fact did attend the performance when I finally raised the money in 2015, and she came to the performance in the ZK Matthews Hall.
You have also worked together with many important musicians. This ranges from collaborations with Elsa Bizitzman to Tim Rice. Please tell me more about your collaborations.
I've been very fortunate. So Elsa Bizitzman was an experience all on its own, but it was not the beginning of that kind of work. I had worked previously actually with a Belgian singer in the Western Cape, and we had done a lot of Jacques Brel, particularly because she was Belgian, and other French and Flemish works. And so I had quite a history of working in what I would loosely call cafe theatre more than cabaret, because if you use the word cabaret in this country, inevitably you are going to think of people with very few clothes on and doing pole dancing. So the cabaret we're talking about here is more a European concept of cabaret, where the singer would then walk around the restaurant and engage with the patrons if you're in a restaurant, or there would be a little stage and there would be some costumes, and I accompanied her. And so we worked as a duo. And when I came up to Johannesburg, I then worked with another musician called Michelle Hill, and I had known her for quite a while at the College of Music as well. and we had put a little show together which went to the restaurant opposite the Market Theatre. It was called the Yard of Ale, and we did 2 shows there. And from there, I went on to work for Elsie Zietsman via the artistic community who knew about me, and I think Kevin Feather at the time approached me, and he had worked a lot with Elsie, I think, and asked me if I would be interested in accompanying her. So I did. And so we went around and did gigs all over the country, and 1 or 2 at the Black Sun at 12 o'clock at night. I have to say that I'm a morning person and Elsie is an evening person. So I'm not sure whether that was more difficult for her or me, because by midnight I was probably, my wheels were coming off, and then the next morning, if we had to go and do a gig somewhere, I was chirping already at about 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and Elsie would rather have had silence at that time. So, and then if you were asking about Tim Rice, Tim Rice came out of this country with his cricket team years ago. It would have been in the 1990s, I think, and I was busy doing a show for Richard Loring, which is called the Webber and Rice Show. It ran for two years, I think. And they needed a pianist to go to Cape Town with the group, and so I went with them, and I was just very lucky to meet Tim Rice and his cricket team, who came out here. They're called the Heartaches. In fact, I have the little plaque from the Heartaches right here, so he took part in that show. We changed the show a bit, and he spoke, obviously, and he told us that he had always wanted to be a singer, a pop singer actually, and that's how he got into the music industry a bit. But of course he's a wonderful lyric writer. But he said he didn't have much of a voice, and he said if he'd known earlier on what he knew later, that would not have stopped him, because it didn't seem to be all that necessary to have a fantastic voice to be a pop singer. But these are his views, not necessarily mine. But he was just a lovely character, very nice human being, and so he was kind enough to listen to my work, and he has written some recommendations of my work which appear on my website. And we have kept contact once or twice over the years. I think he came out here for the Lion King. I think I sent him a piece of my wedding cake as well, and he also wrote back to me to say he was pleased to see that my creativity was not in the least extinguished by marriage. But basically we haven't really kept touch because he's got a very busy life. I mean, he ended up, working with Elton John, and he, I don't know what has happened to him now. I presume he might still be living in London. It would be interesting to actually try and look him up again. I suppose I could drop him a line. He might remember me.
I also see you have some Afrikaans songs on your work list.
Yes, now remembering that I've had quite a lot of influence of Afrikaans in my life from my piano teacher from when I was about 11 or 12 years old, Angeline Scholz, and University of Pretoria, Port Elizabeth and Pretoria, and through Jack de Wet and all the pupils that he brought down who played the violin, who were all from the Free State University. So I had all that influence. I went to university for 2 years, and some of my subjects were in Afrikaans, so I had to really study that quite a bit, because I went to an English girls' school, so I had Afrikaans for matric. And then I married Paul Bukoy, who is Dutch, from a Dutch background, and so he wanted to learn English, funnily enough, so we mostly spoke English at home, but of course I was exposed a lot to Afrikaans through him. And so I thought I would try my hand at writing a few Afrikaans lyrics, which I did for fun. And some of my songs have my own lyrics, and some of them have the lyrics of Bernard Janse van Rensburg, who was the psychiatrist poet I spoke to you about earlier, and sadly who died earlier this year. So I just set those lyrics the way I would set any language, whether it's French or English or any other language, I don't know.
Your work in the various fields certainly contributed towards deeper insights into the various parts of the music scene. That's composition, performance, directing, education, fundraising, and so forth. What would your advice be for young composers starting off?
What I would advise any musician, whether they are a composer or a performer, is to get some kind of business related or administration related or marketing related or whatever it is, education as well, because we are now we're now in rather difficult times, and unless you are a top artist very early on and you have a manager or an agent or somebody who's actually finding you the work, and then you're able to carry on a career like that, you are going to have to manage it yourself. And I think one of the most difficult areas to manage for artists is always this area of marketing themselves, and managing their finances. And as that doesn't sound very creative, but I think it would give one more security. And when artists have a little bit more security, they feel encouraged, I think, to create. It's not actually all that romantic to create when you are starving. It's very difficult when your back is against the wall. So, but I also would say, please listen to your inner voice. I think maybe that even more than get the education, because that's a rather, that's my mind speaking. That's my mind saying, please look after yourselves and find ways to do that which are manageable. My other side says, you have to follow your own instinct. You have to follow your own voice. If you haven't found that voice and you're not following it, then I would say that is actually probably your main task. And believe in it. Don't be bullied by other people who think that you should do it this way instead of that way. Unless they're your mentors who are supporting you and giving you some guidance, that's different to bullying. And don't be bullied by the technology of the music industry either, or, as I say, the thought police, or what may, people who regard themselves as the compositional police. Look at that, regard it, examine it, but don't be bullied by it.
You have recently done a course in film music.
So very briefly then, I thought that I would invest in myself a little bit, and I attended the Film Scoring Academy of Europe summer school course, which would normally have taken place in Varna in Bulgaria. And that's a beach town, so it would have been marvelous to spend some time on the beach and in the open air. And everybody has told us how beautiful the scenery is and how marvelous the food is, and that we should definitely come back next year. But this year, because of COVID-19, it just wasn't possible. And so we were all at home in our own countries, and that in itself was quite a challenge and very interesting, because we had people in Australia and America and in Europe and me in South Africa, all trying to engage in this program. And so that we were in different time zones. Some people had to stay up until all hours, some people had to get up incredibly early. It was a very intensive course. I have to say I found it fascinating, most of it. And it was quite challenging, not so much, well, the course itself obviously, in getting you to look at writing music perhaps in a different way, but although I'm slightly familiar with that, I've written music for television and for adverts in the past, and I have to say that I need to really spend some time improving my digital technological skills, because I date from the era of quarter-inch tape at the SABC. So I have worked in Sibelius mostly, but I haven't worked much in the digital audio workstation. So, and I think it's really a case of also knowing the screen geography of what you're doing in your program. So knowing your program a bit. It's not all that difficult to lay down tracks and to record things. That's pretty easy because I have all the keyboard skills. But the engineering side of things, I would need to have a stronger look at. Or work with an assistant, obviously, who has more of those skills, which I do find helpful. And then the film music history side was very fascinating. Writing to picture was interesting. Also writing perhaps in the kind of approach to writing for animation. As I said, it was a very intensive course, and also here it was tremendously cold in Johannesburg, so I'm afraid that was challenging from that point of view as well. In that some of the time we didn't have electricity, and then at one point I think one of my computers fell on the ground, and so they had to go and be repaired, and I was then working on a PC, whereas previously I worked on the Mac, and then the Mac came back and I put all my material onto it again, but they were not compatible, so there were quite a lot of digital issues. And so it was very challenging, but I do feel as if I was stretched, and we are due to receive our 6 university credits for doing this course soon. I'm hoping they might be in the mail. It comes from the Irish University. They are connected to the Dolly studio in Bulgaria, where the live musicians then performed our work and recorded, and we were able to sit in well, if we had been there, we would have been actually sitting in the control room listening to people record our work, or we could have also conducted it, I suppose, if we really wanted to. But I have been in music studios a lot before, and so I think even though I can conduct, I probably wouldn't have asked to do that under pressure. You know, they have something like 15 minutes to record your whole piece. So now you don't know the musicians, the conductor does. You know, he's worked with them before. It's not a wise thing to do, even if you are. You should actually stay out of and not interfere, actually. Yes. Because they've got very little time to get your piece of music together. And it was fascinating in that we were working with some clips which we can't put onto the internet or anywhere actually, because they're all intellectual property. But just to give you an idea, I worked a little bit with creating music for a library scene taken from something about a mind. I have to think of the title of that now. It's got a very unusual title. The second one was actually an extract from Game of Thrones. And there was a beautiful scene of a woman with blonde hair and the ocean and a ship and returning to her homeland. Those of you who are Game of Thrones fans will probably know the scene I'm talking about, where she then journeys to the shore and walks up the hill and goes into this empty castle. And I had improvised something to that, and I was just lucky, and also I suppose in the way that it worked and came together. It was very different from some of the other music that was being written. And it just worked emotionally and held that scene together. Although I did get the feeling that it was not entirely approved of. I think my way of going about things is probably very different from the way that the film music world wants you to go about it. They do like to guide you along in the way that they feel, and particularly the more engineering people would like you to then be doing a more carpet and wallpaper sort of sound canvassy approach to it, creating a sound world. And while I'm sure that also is extremely valid, and it's not the only way. And then of course we had other people on the course who most definitely are protagonists of melody and harmony, and in their own work they definitely look for the perfect melody or whatever it is. So interesting, those two sort of poles, if you like, of the discussion. And very enriching, and I made a lot of very good contacts. Most of them are about a half, if not a third of my age, so they were very accommodating and very kind and very helpful, especially when I got a bit lost with technology. And I hope I might get a chance to meet some of them one day. I mean, they're at a totally different phase of their career to mine, but in a way I'm also a beginner, so many of them are starting out in the film industry. And I hope I get an opportunity. In fact, I will have an opportunity to write music for my own little movie. I didn't tell you about my own little movie. I managed to get some funding, and it came through during the film scoring course from the National Film and Video Foundation. And I had applied for funding to develop The Rainbow's Child as a stop frame animation movie, and the stop frame animator is Dick Grobler, who's agreed to work with me from Pretoria, who is a real master at stop frame. And he's had several movies win awards, and he's connected in festivals all over the world, so I'm very privileged to have him. And I've literally asked him to guide me through the script writing of this, because it's very different writing script for a movie or writing script for stop frame. And he's explained to me that it's a bit more like painting a picture, actually, stop frame animation, which is a fascinating concept. So there didn't seem to be any point in my rushing off to write a script that he can't use, so we'll work on it together and he will give me guidance, and then I'll have to create that. And then next year in April, presuming it all goes well, I will apply for production funding, and then it's more over to Dick and what he will make of the script.
Amazing.
So then I will hopefully write the music and, you know, be involved in the sound and the audio side of it. And I'm hoping to also perhaps do some more of this in Britain. You know, we got a lot of advice from the film scoring people there, also in terms of how to engage in the industry, how to write letters to producers, how to introduce yourself to filmmakers, to go to festivals, to actually meet people, and network. And I'm usually quite good at networking, and I like meeting people. And also I have a great friend over there who emigrated 2 years ago with his wife. He's a broker, but he's got one foot in music. He always has had. He's also written music for movies, and so we are going to put our audio equipment together. and his son is also involved. They're more also on the engineering side, so that would be a support. And so we'll discuss it when I'm over there and see if we can set up a studio and attract some work. And I don't know what will come out of it. I'm just interested to go and explore.
You mentioned Britain, so I know that you are relocating to Britain now. So can you maybe tell me more about that and perhaps other projects that you're currently working on, compositional projects?
Yes, I can. So I'm relocating to the UK because I think it's an adventure. And my grandmother was born there in 1892, and just because I can, I thought I would try and go before I get so old that I can't. All right, so if I have to talk to you about some works that I'm working on, I had started, in fact, before the Film Scoring Academy. I'm back on Afrikaans poems, funnily enough.
Oh.
You know, any language is just a fascinating thing. It's a bit like working with clay. It's just a slightly different kind of clay. So I have some poetry that was given to me many years ago. It was a doctor who lived in the Western Cape, and he and his wife unfortunately died in a car accident, but he had given me all this poetry. And when I brought it up here and I worked with Louis van Rensburg years ago, he read some of it and said, "This man reminds me of Boerneef." So he called this old poet a Kaapse Boerneef. Okay, so a Cape, I don't know what you would call Boerneef, except that it's rather lyrical and sensitive and a beautiful poetry, actually, Boerneef. And he had written Vos haar nooi, just to give you an idea. So that was one of Boerneef's poems.
Yes, that was said by Louis van Rensburg.
Yes, and in fact this old doctor in the Western Cape had said to me, "You've got to meet the composer of Vos haar nooi, because he's just special and it's a beautiful melody." And so just by coincidence, when I was living up here in the 1980s, I got a phone call from the SABC to say, "Please would you come in and work as a session pianist," which I've also done over many years. "And please come and play because there's a composer here called Louis van Rensburg and he needs you to actually do some of the keyboard work on some of his." And we got to work together and we became business partners, and he was the composer for Vos haar nooi. And so I, in fact, then also introduced this little old doctor to Louis when they came up here on holiday. I managed to get them together so they could just have their photograph taken and sort of, you know, shake hands and have a chat. And he read some of the old man's poetry. His name was Con Vivier. And so I'm not in contact with his children anymore, but if any of them are out there, or his grandchildren, I'd love to hear from them, because I still have all of Con's poetry, and it's about little animals. Little whatever, you know, a chameleon or a little lizard or a little bird, and it's very South African poetry. And I thought I'd write some children's songs, and of course the French have done this in the past. And so you get these tiny little songs written by Poulenc, and they're sung by a baritone with piano, for instance. And I rather like working in that medium with a singer and piano, so I'm working on those. Those will be miniatures. And so that's the other thing that I'm looking at. I have to say the tango is a bit muddled, and I think it was because I started working on it and there were so many threads coming from my past life, and I was trying to find a new dance. I'm trying to find a new way, and yet we have now gone into COVID-19, and so the whole world is finding this new dance, if you like. And there are a lot of overlays, and I will have to unpick it all again. I'll have to go back to the basics and see if I can use any of that material in a different way, not such an obvious way. The way I'd gone about it, it felt to me as if I've got one foot in film music and one foot in old Spanish music and one foot in modern music, overlaid with all my layers and complexities, and it's a confused language. And I suppose when you are changing direction in life or taking on something new, there is an element of confusion. So I'm not against that, and I think I'm starting to take the steps one by one in my new dance. So I'm sure the music will come out of that.
Well, thank you very much. There's lots more that we could talk about. I know that you have many projects you worked on. When you mentioned the film music, I thought about the theme music of Arende that you worked on. Yes, as I said, there are many things we could talk about. But thank you very much for your time, and thank you for giving some of your precious time to have a talk to me.
It's wonderful to have this opportunity. I wish that everybody could have the opportunity to create, and in fact I think that would be my last thing I would like to say. that if you feel even that you have a little spark of creativity, no matter what it is, even if it's making something out of a little piece of wood, or singing your own little song in the shower, or dancing your own few little steps in private, even if that's what you do, remember you're a creative being. You are a special and sacred and creative being, and make the most of it.